Right, today we're doing a video called The Rise and Fall and Rise and Fall and Rise of Germany. I think I'm wearing the appropriate t-shirt for the matter, so let's dive right in.
Before Germany, there was a Prussia and Austria and 37 small independent German countries. Napoleon had left Europe in an awful mess. That's when he lost, the victorious met in Vienna to fix the borders that he'd thrown all into disarray. This Congress of Vienna wasn't a punishment like a certain treaty a century later would be to Germany, but instead to re-stabilise the continent once more by drawing out the spheres of influence, balancing enemies and allies with and against each other. And this worked, for a while. The fixed borders and disincentives to war meant that those with ambitions to conquer an empire turned their ambitions elsewhere, to other continents. But there was one fractured region in Europe that was not particularly well balanced, and the two intended balancing powers didn't have overseas colonies on which to take out their frustration. That region was Central Europe, that aforementioned Austria, Prussia, and those 37 smaller independent German countries. The war that eventually happened had been the result of a centuries-old rivalry between the two dominant German powers, and the result of the war was mostly down to four factors: the existing political order, Central European geography, the Enlightenment, and Italy. Prussia and most of the small states were situated in an area of Europe with few natural barriers. Now, while this could make you vulnerable, as the many partitions of Poland can tell you, the way German states behaved was part of what preserved the relative stability of the region despite it being in almost 300 pieces for a millennium. While individually these mostly city-states are vulnerable to outsiders, they recognise the need to band together, multiple times under multiple flags. Collections of states of roughly equal power, so none could really dominate, or at least that was the theory. So Europe was a collection of states in a delicate balance of powers, and at its centre was a collection of states in a delicate balance of powers. In geopolitics, geography is everything. That's rivers, mountains, oceans, terrain, and where your borders lie in relation. Austria was a southeast-facing country with the majority of its land in that direction from Vienna. The branches of the Danube flowed through Austria away from traditional German lands. The Alps and Carpathians mostly protected the core from invaders, but they also isolated Austria from its interests in the north and the west, and its territories on the other side of the mountains. Contrast Prussia, a country wealthy with natural riverine connection, and none of those pesky major mountain ranges separating the political core from its wealthy and industrious region in the west, and as well as those rivers, Prussia also had a better artificial network. Modern canals had arrived with the Industrial Revolution, and together with the smaller states, Prussia had a national railway network before its major neighbours had even connected two cities. Austria was excluded from all of this because of its geography. These networks initially implied Prussia as the leader of Germany, and
Yeah, so those railway networks actually came in a lot of handy when Prussia tried to unify Germany later. During the American Civil War, the Americans, or the North rather, was using railroads and building new railroads to move troops and supplies all over the battlefield. When Prussia observed the war and realized that this was a thing, they already had railroads, and so what they did is they expanded the railroads a bit and militarized them so that they were be able to move troops and supplies anywhere they needed to go, whether it be on the French border against the Austrians. The Germans were fighting a lot of people in a lot of different times, so they needed to get around very fast. And it was one of the earliest forms of Germans, I don't want to say blitzkrieg, but the rapid warfare, getting troops to the battlefield fast and winning a war fast. Because, as I said with Germany, with Prussia, they were very wide open geographically. They didn't have any real protection from invaders, so they had to be able to rapidly move their troops from one place to another very quickly.
isolated Austria. Germany was integrated culturally, economically, militarily, and bureaucratically around Berlin. And while Prussia was in the process of connecting, Austria was dividing. The Enlightenment was the culmination of a philosophical revolution that led in part to the idea of self-determination. With failures of political and economic systems across the continent, the traditional order had been collapsing piece by piece, and in its place, new schools of thought were to arise. Here's an example of how a pre-Enlightenment country worked.
I don't want to have to pay all these taxes. I want to rule myself.
Why you living in my house, Booster? You abide by my rules.
What gives you the authority to decide what I have to do?
God, you don't know. It's written down in this book that you can read because it's in Latin. But trust me, I know it's in there.
One socio-political philosophical revolution later, and people broke those rules, and the Bible was translated anyway. People could now directly read the Word of God and interpret it in their own way, which led to an explosion in different schools of thought and churches. The Catholic Church was no longer all-powerful, and the Word of God was no longer simply what you were told. People could think for themselves.
Yeah, the translation of the Bible into German and then later other languages was actually a very big moment in history because, as he says, people were able to think for themselves and take religion for what themselves. And they came up with all these different ideologies, different interpretations of things. But more than that, it caused literacy to increase because now everybody wanted to read the Bible. They didn't have to take it from someone who read Latin. They just learned how to read some basic of whatever their native language was, in this case German, and they could read the Bible, and they could interpret it for themselves. But it also really broke the hegemony that the Catholic Church had over Germany, and with that fall, really, really hurt the Catholic Church. And it obviously led to a lot of warfare and a lot of violence between countries and religions for a long time. But it was definitely a changing point in global history, European history, but definitely in German history. It's probably one of the biggest points in their history, just in the way that it separated Germany from many of its rivals. So it's some of its rivals that would be its rivals until well into the 20th century. We see that Germany and France never quite reconcile the differences, and they go to war several times, and more times than not, Germany wins. But a lot of those hard feelings that came between Germany and some other states existed because of this time, because of the breakaway from the Catholic Church, because of the pre-Enlightenment age and going into the Enlightenment age. A lot of it was because of this. Germany was the birthplace of Protestantism, and Protestantism was seen as the enemy in a lot of places, and so Germany was seen as the birthplace of the enemy. Which, like I said, was a contributing factor to a lot of the rivalries that it would have far into its future.
And now they could rule themselves. And then later the French and American revolutions were all about self-determination and religion in government. Now let's look back at these 37 smaller independent German nations. In all of this furore, wasn't it just time for the region to unify? But around which of the two strong German powers would it be? Prussia or Austria? Let's compare. Prussia had great water and rail connections with the region. With Prussia they shared a single common language. They were majority ethnic German, and Prussia had one of the strongest armies on the continent. Austria, however, was on the other side of the mountains, had 100 billion different...
Yes, the Prussian army was actually very well known for being one of the strongest armies. It's arguable that the French had its strongest army as well. I believe the French had the biggest and strongest army. But the Prussian army wasn't exceptionally large. It was just exceptionally well trained. They had some of the most modern weapons, strategies, tactics. They also utilized professional soldiering instead of conscripts or bringing in untrained peasants. When you were a soldier for the Prussians, you were a soldier for life. You joined, you were a soldier for life. And they trained you and educated you as a soldier and nothing else. That being said, it really caused Prussia to have one of the greatest militaries in Europe at the time, and was the backbone for what would become the German military later, all the way up to, again, the 20th century. Then we see why Germany has such a good, strong, well-trained military in pretty much every war. It comes from this Prussian ideal of not having the biggest or strongest, but having the best and most capable. And you combine that with the railways and the rapid warfare tactics they had, and the Clausewitz theories that would come soon after this. Germany became very, very difficult to defeat, and most countries had no idea how to fight them at this time.
Languages,
especially Austria.
Territory was rebellious and fragile from top to bottom, and was a country out of time. In fact, Austria was lucky to still exist as a multinational country after the Congress of Vienna. Most other new and reformed countries had abandoned the because God says so form of government and graduated to the nation-state self-determinism model, but not Austria. She married her way to the top, merging royal families and lands to build this empire. and she wanted to keep it all after the Congress, and that she did. However, the Czechs, Slovaks, Polish, Hungarians, Slovenians, Italians, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Ukrainians and Romanians in her empire had different ideas that came from the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Ironically, one of the last places to unify in this period under the idea of the self-determined nation state was perhaps the seat of philosophical thought in Europe, Italy. 1866. Those Austrian lands that I mentioned earlier were on the other side of the Alps. Yeah, some of those were filled with Italians. That's a group of people who were currently warring their way across southern Europe, unifying under their flag. And Austria was in the way. They fought 3 wars to unify their lands under the because we said so kind of government. The first war didn't change much. The second war was a mild victory for Italy. The third war, however, came with incredible timing and was incredibly devastating to the future of Austria. The sweet relationship between Austria and Hungary that had worked for so long was souring. A series of wars of independence had to be managed, and worst of all, Hungary itself was in revolt. Prussia, seeing a rising power in the south and the potential downfall of a rival for the German leadership, decided that they might as well consolidate their problems into one easily repayable continental war. Austria was in no shape to lead anything by the end of the war. Not the German Confederation, not Germany, and by this point not even Austria. Hungarians made themselves equal in the empire, which now went by a different name. The kingdom and lands represented in the Imperial Council and the lands of the Holy Hungarian Crown of St. Stephen, or as we know it today, Austria-Hungary. Prussia easily scooped the remains of German Europe, and with a victory over France in yet another war, they declared the birth of the German Empire in the...
Yes, those are a series of wars that happened between Germany and Austria. The first one was actually relatively close. It was a short, brief war that was fought over a territory in Denmark, actually, and it didn't really end too decisively, more in the Prussians' favor than the Austrians, but it wasn't a decisive blow to either one. The second time, however, the Prussians took on the Austrians, and absolutely, it was a very one-sided war. The Prussians absolutely destroyed them. It was not even close. It was a very, very short war because the Austrians knew they were horribly outmatched and there was no chance of going to win. So they just backed off, and the fight was not over really any territories per se, but it was more over who was going to be the dominant German force, who was going to be the unifier of the German states. Because both Austria and Prussia wanted to unify Germany, and a lot of the German states wanted to be unified. They just didn't know how to do it or who to go with. A lot of the southern states favored Austria, but after this conflict, Austria was in no position to lead anyone. So a lot of these southern states that were initially opposed to Prussia ended up allying with Prussia, knowing that if they didn't ally with Prussia, they may wind up one of their next targets. Nobody really wanted to piss off Prussia at this time. That was probably one of the most one-sided conflicts of the time. Maybe closely followed by the Franco-Prussian War, which we see the end of here, which is another quick war, happened in 1871, and it was less than a year, and the French military was actually defeated in a matter of a couple of months. It was a siege of Paris that took a long time because Emperor Napoleon of France, he didn't want to surrender. He refused to surrender for months, even though people were starving. It was a very quick and decisive victory for the Germans, and in the peace deal, they forced Napoleon III to recognize the German Empire as a sovereign state, which under international law meant they were indeed a state, their own country, and then they forced him to abdicate the throne right afterwards. So, and it was done in the House of Versailles, which would be the first of many controversial treaties signed in Versailles, and important to Germany and France and their feelings towards one another.
The Palace of Versailles, the French seat of power. At this point, what couldn't Prussia do? Austria-Hungary was a shambles on a rapid descent in power and wealth. It was an absolute tinderbox ready to ignite at the flick of a trigger. World War I. And despite for some reason allying with Austria-Hungary, the pair nearly steamrolled all of Europe, fueled by German industry. For the second time in half a century, Germany capitalised over the internal volatility of a neighbouring country to make significant territorial gains, making it as far as 1,500 kilometres from Berlin, and essentially winning in the east, making all of these gains real and official, at least for a few months. One Treaty of Versailles, one demilitarization, one hyperinflation.
Yeah, one of the things about World War One is that Germany came very close to winning that war on several occasions. They were very, very effective against the Russians. They would have steamrolled over the French had the British not come to their aid. They had Austria-Hungary as an ally. They had, well, technically the Italians are supposed to be their ally, but they turned on them. And they did the Ottomans as their ally, but did they really need them? Not really. The Austrians were very ineffective. The Italians ended up turning on them anyways, and the Ottomans really just drew some attention away from the main European theater. But overall, the Germans did very, very well against numerous things. I've said it a million times, the Germans are very, very good at war. The problem is they're very bad at making everybody else mad when they fight a war, and then often wind up fighting too many people at the same time in a situation they can't win. It happens in World War One. It happens in World War Two. They just piss off too many people, and they find themselves overwhelmed very quickly. And their method of rapid warfare is ineffective against the sheer numbers of their enemies.
Billions in reparations, one Great Depression, 2 decades of economic and social turmoil, and still, again, the country was nearly able to steamroll Europe a second time in the 20th century. And then, one demilitarization, one partial deindustrialization, several occupations, one Cold War partition, half a century of separation, and then finally, unification.
Yeah, after the devastation that Germany wrought on Europe over the course of the Franco-Prussian War and the both World Wars, the rest of Europe was afraid of Germany. They were afraid that if they allowed Germany to be unified still, they would just do it again. Eventually there'd be another world war, there'd be another major conflict, and Germany was going to stomp out its enemies and cause a lot of problems until enough people were able to stand up to them. And with the divide between the Soviets and the West, they weren't really sure if Germany were to try it again, if there would be enough people to stop them. Because if the Soviets decided to let Germany stomp over the West, who's really going to stop them? Probably the United States, but at what cost? How much damage is it going to do before they're stopped? If they go after the Soviets went, well, yeah, we could probably beat them, but again, it's going to be a highly costly war. So everybody decided to sort of partition Germany into many pieces for the safety of Europe. There's actually a book that I don't have, but I wish I did. It's called Germany Will Try It Again. It was written in 1944, before the war was over, and it's basically making the argument that once Germany is defeated, you have to split the country up. You have to remove Germany as a country, or they're going to start another war. In hindsight, looking at what actually happened in history, it's sort of a funny read now, but it's actually very interesting at the same time to think what people were thinking in the mid-40s when the war was beginning to come to a close in the Allies' favor.
And today, this country is stunningly, once again, the economic and industrial centre of Europe, and practically its leader. But not in war this time, that's bad apparently. It's in the boardroom, on the leaderboard, the GDP rankings, the quality of life, and the football. France kept a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because a unified Germany was an incredible threat to them for a century, constantly upsetting Europe, dragging France again and again into catastrophic bloodshed. Until today, France still maintained one of the most expensive militaries in the world. They built the iron and coal community to make war unthinkable by tying their economies together.
Yeah, again, that's the whole thing. Germany really scared the bejesus out of Europe, especially the French. The French knew that in World War One, the British not come to their aid, they would have lost that war. In World War Two, they did lose the war. In the Franco-Prussian War, they did lose the war. They were very, very scared of a strong Germany, and a lot of it just came down to military doctrine, that the Germans just had a doctrine that was going to beat the French pretty much every time. So the French, every time a war ended, they went to great lengths to modernize the military, increase the military spending, have as many men as they possibly can, and each time it still wasn't enough. Germany sort of had their number in a way, but yeah, the Germans really scared Europe a lot because of how effective they were at warfare for a very long time, and how quickly they could go from being this demilitarized force to suddenly a horrifically powerful global power in Europe, able to take on pretty much the rest of Europe at once and maybe not win, but definitely put up a good fight.
Together and take access to Germany's vast mineral and geographic wealth. In a Europe without borders, that's the great equaliser, no? It turns out the Germans turned even that to their advantage. The EU is a free and ready-made market. Germany is, as of 2016, by some measures, the #1 exporting country in the world, competing with China, a country 20 times the size. And there are things that Germany has coped with better than any other Western country. After World War II, there was somewhat of a labour shortage, which was apparently something to do with all the working age men dying in catastrophic bloodshed or something, and they plugged the labour shortage with Mediterranean guest workers. The potential collapse of the economy due to the structure of the welfare state and the ageing of the population that as of 2016 is taking its toll on Japan, Russia and Eastern Europe, soon to hit China and the West, and is being plugged in the Germany of the 2000s by citizens of the expanding EU, the best and the brightest of working age across the continent coming to Germany to work. That's a steady stream of potential tax-paying skilled workers and crucially their consumers, paying for the pensions of the aging and retired Germans, spending their twilight years finding Lebensraum, this time on the sunbeds of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, so it makes a lot of good points. It's a very brief video over German history, but it makes a lot of good points about German history. You know, you see the beginnings of the rivalries that they have with the rest of Europe. You see the geographical position that Prussia was in that forced them to sort of have the kind of military that they had if they wanted to really defeat anybody, or even defend themselves. We see the evolution of this military into a larger military as Germany evolved into the German Empire and later even the Third Reich. But Germany has always sort of bounced back from all these situations. They've always been very good because they're very good at economics. And even now, as he's talking about at the end there, Germany is sort of attracting workers and students from all around the world. You can get a college education for free in Germany. Top of the line education. It's not some, you know, small state school either. Pretty much any public institution, you can get a free education. If you go to the private ones, they usually have a tuition cap that's very, very low. And a lot of this is to attract students, and they have programs that are in all sorts of different languages, mostly English and German, but they do cover lots of different languages so that they can get people from all over. They teach their students English at a very young age, so that most Germans now speak English to some degree, to at least a functional degree. They have a lot of benefits for workers, for people who want to immigrate to Germany, especially among the countries within the EU, where it's very easy to immigrate. But they have a lot of things that make it really desirable to go over there, and that's sort of just because, as I said, they lost pretty much a whole generation in World War II and never really recovered from that, as other countries like Japan never really recovered from that theirs either. But Germany found a way. Germany has found a way, and they have bounced back to being probably the preeminent power in Europe right now. So this was definitely a good, interesting video. I think there are much longer videos that we could watch that have a lot more information, but as just a quick and dirty, this was a very good one. So I'm going to end the video right there. If you have anything else that you'd like me to watch, just put it in the comments section. If you like the video, please like and